Professor Beaton and Professor Ricks, thank you very much for having us here. We would like to start and ask you about the position of history in modern Greek studies at King's. We know that this is an interdisciplinary program, so we'd like to discuss with you what happens with history.
Well, I mean, as it happens, the program at King's really began with modern Greek history. As I'm sure you know, the initiative to establish the Korais Chair of Modern Greek and Byzantine History, Language and Literature goes back to 1915 or 1916. 1915 or 1916. It was during the First World War, when the Philhellene principal of King's, Ronald Burroughs, was close to Eleftherios Venizelos, his minister at Athens, Ioannis Gennadios, and various prominent members of the Greek community in London, including the future second wife of Venizelos, Elena Skilitsi. And part of the paraskinia, the sort of background to this initiative, was the diplomatic manoeuvring about the position of Greece in the First World War. An important player was the Anglo-Hellenic League, which had been founded by academics and business people in London in 1913, at the time of the Second Balkan War. So, I mean, right from the beginning, the idea was to introduce into the curriculum in British universities awareness of and interest in the then contemporary and modern history of Greece. It wasn't about classics, it wasn't about Byzantine studies, and I think the reason that the chair finally was baptized with this rather cumbersome title it has today was that once the endowment had been made and the money was available, the chair had to be defined in some way. And I think the academics at that time, they were so used to the classical world, and this was Greece, you know, modern Greece, particularly clearly. Burroughs was very interested in modern Greek history. You know, how do you present this academically? And they simply thought of, you know, they put together everything that was Greek but was not also classical, and they put it under this single chair that they then named after Korais. It was always going to be interdisciplinary, but history was there from the beginning. History is named first in the various components of the chair, and as you know, notoriously the first holder of the chair was Arnold J. Toynbee. Now, Toynbee, of course, was no friend to Greece, and he made a great deal of trouble for himself with the benefactors and King's College and the University of London when he was here. But, you know, one of the things that's important about Toynbee, you know, he went on to become, I mean, nobody really remembers Toynbee now, but for about 20 or 30 years in the middle of the 20th century, he was one of the big-time historians of the whole world. And, you know, I mean, he was in Time magazine in America, you know, everybody had heard of Toynbee, and his 12 volumes of a study of history, the whole of world history. You know, probably not many people read it all, but lots of people thought they had an idea of what it was about. And the nucleus of that whole understanding of world history, the rise and fall of empires, really began with Toynbee's personal experience as Korais professor, when he went off moonlighting, working for the Manchester Guardian in Smyrna during the Greco-Turkish War. So, you know, institutionally, he made an awful mess of it. But Toynbee's experience of the chair and the controversy that he himself created also, I think, you know, people now recognise, lies at the very centre of his vast edifice of understanding world history, which is very influential in the 20th century. And moving forward in time, as it happens, the majority of holders of the chair since Toynbee have been historians by profession, though I think there was a bit of an alarm about being too contemporary after Toynbee. So the most distinguished holders, Romilly Jenkins, Cyril Mango, Donald Nicol, they were all historians, but they were historians of Byzantium rather than modern Greece.
Though one might want to add that, of course, Romilly Jenkins made some contribution to the modern Greek historiography with his Solomos book in 1940.
Right.
though it's now outdated, and also more controversially with his very anti-Greek book about the Thylacine murders, which was his final intellectual encounter with the modern Greeks, and which inspired, it worth noting, inspired the famous poem by Andreas Empirikos, who was once a student at King's College, or Dromos. So I think in the overall package at King's, people have always thought that history and literature, literary study should rub shoulders in the modern period.
And how do you comment on the directions in modern Greek studies, both at King's and elsewhere? It seems that this is a field of studies that has been going on for, let's say, more than a century now. Has this been a linear process? Have there been changes, new directions, new themes? Is there an internal periodization, according to you? And how about the future?
Right, I mean, it's always easy to talk about the past, isn't it?
Yes.
As historians, you'll be used to this too. I mean, not just at King's, but in British universities in general, modern Greek studies, an interdisciplinary sort of pattern, really took off and really began to develop at the time of the Junta and just after. And I think it was partly because there was a dictatorship actually within Europe, and Greece was in the news in a way that it had been even before, of course, at the time of the Civil War. In fact, a lot of British involvement and interest, like intellectual interest in Greece, goes back to the Second World War and the time of the Civil War. But I think there was a particular coming together in the 1970s, and that's when, if I can. Slightly applies more to me than to you, David, but I feel my generation, people slightly older than me, it was sort of self-evident that modern Greek studies was what we wanted to make our academic careers of, whereas for previous generations that wasn't really an option. But partly because Greece had been so much in the headlines, and entirely independently, different universities really consolidated and built upon what they'd already got. So in Birmingham there was, the Marxist classicist George Thompson, who established, a very strong line of continuity in modern Greek studies in the 60s. At King's, the ideological climate was completely different. But it's the end of the 1960s when Richard Clogg first came to King's. He was jointly at King's and CEAS, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, and immediately began to develop a curriculum in teaching modern Greek and Balkan history in the University of London. Peter Mackridge came in, I think, 1974, and it was really from that time that the single subject degree, Modern Greek Language and Literature, it was called at first, then it was Modern Greek Studies. And for, 30, 40 years, I mean, we had never huge numbers, but we had about half a dozen students each year enrolling in a degree program where they would learn the language, they would study the literature, they would take at least some courses in modern Greek history, and latterly some courses also in Byzantine studies.
So
would you consider the 70s as a critical moment?
As a sort of formative period.
There's a micro point and a macro point. I mean, the micro point, which is very important, is a sort of upsurge of what you could call a sort of modern Philhellenism because of the history of the Junta and its opponents outside Greece. So in 1975, if I remember the date rightly, London had this Greek week with Greek month. I mean, sorry, of course, with very rich cultural offerings across all of the arts and so on. And at King's, in addition to the people we've mentioned so far, for a period there was Philip Sherrard, the noted Orthodox thinker, and so on. But in the wider context, you also had this big phase of fashionability for area studies Balkan studies, Soviet studies, East European, South Asian, and so on. And the origins of that were undoubtedly Cold War origins, especially in the American universities. But the same was somewhat true here, and I think when we look at the alterations that have come about in modern Greek studies since then, which are in part a story of, as it were, losing its established position, that is also very true of a lot of the other area studies groupings. And that's accentuated in the University of London by the fact that the large institutions which make up this federal university now function separately. So I think following Effie's question, in some ways one of the questions looking in the future is how we rebuild interdisciplinarity and interest when there isn't large government money coming in to support area studies, because that's a contribution towards the Western Cold War environment.
Right. And can I ask also about internal phases? Your mind, if there are, let's say, particular phases within the field, the history of the field, that have to do with specific themes or schools of thought or interests, scholarly and research interests. What would you think? For instance, today I think modern Greek studies tend to be very, globalized, to put it this way. They have a particular interest, perhaps, especially in the US, in the diaspora, or in minorities in Greece, or let's say ethno-religious communities and identities. I don't know. That might be a new trend in modern Greek studies.
I don't think it's new exactly, because I think some of the continental departments in Copenhagen and places were emphasizing this for quite a long time before that. I think because of our teaching responsibilities, it has now become true in Britain in a way, including King's and actually Oxford and Birmingham, though Birmingham doesn't have its own undergraduate program now, that the teaching is more comparative in spirit in order to try and bring in students from outside. And in that way you have to do more work to introduce students who are just plain English to key elements of modern Greek history than you did before. So that I think it's also, there's a question about the general broadening and loosening of all of our undergraduate curriculum in this country anyway. But modern Greek history does not seem to have much of a presence inside history departments in this country. So if someone works on Italian history, I don't know, Risorgimento or something, they might get a job. I think if they're working on modern Greek history, they probably will not get a job in a big place in the history department, if that doesn't sound too pessimistic. So we don't have lots of other scholars to work with who happen to be
on Greek literature. If you work on Greek literature, the future is better, you think?
No,
for different reasons.
I think the difference would be now that, and this is an intellectual trend which is very helpful to modern Greek studies actually. In classics departments, which are very strong in this country, there's a strong emphasis on reception studies. And there are some very able classical scholars like Pantelis Michaelakis at Bristol, people like that, who work on the modern Greek reception of the ancient past. There are many others, Emily Greenwood at Yale and so on, a whole generation. This is another opportunity for people with modern Greek interest to interact with larger subject communities. So it isn't, it sometimes might feel like a tale of decline from inside, but it is more about the mutation of different trends. But the area studies model is dead, isn't it?
Probably, yes. I mean, and that's interesting. I mean, as that conversation's gone on, I mean, I feel, Effie, I've understood better what you were asking a few moments ago. And I think the way I'd be inclined to sum it up is that for sort of 30 years after the 1970s, the standard model that, particularly for undergraduate teaching, that we followed, I mean, the 4 universities followed in this country, was basically that of the language and literature, modern language and literature, in the way that French was studied, German was studied, Russian, Italian, and so on. Now, two things have really rocked that model very radically. One is that actually all the modern languages degrees of that pattern are in real trouble since about 2000. It goes back to the traditional British laziness about engagement with modern foreign languages, many of us fear. But I mean, it's a demographic fact. It's been consolidated by changes in the school curriculum, disastrous changes in the school curriculum. I mean, so disastrous that the current government has noticed and is taking steps to try to reverse them. But the result is that there are about 10 years worth of students in high school who just don't have the chance of learning a modern foreign language.
At all.
It's beginning to be reversed now, but it'll be years before that comes back into the university curriculum. So, you know, in a world where, I mean, it was being said not so very long ago that, you know, departments of German were going to be closing up and down the country. So you could imagine how precarious we feel in modern Greek, where our roles were always very much smaller. So that's one thing that's really, you know, it's really changed the dominant model. And the other, it has to be, I mean, let's be honest, has to be the crisis in Greece and Cyprus. Because how can I put this? I mean, in the days of the Junta, Greece was going through a terrible time, but people sort of identified with the Greeks and their sufferings, and really wanted to understand about, you know, about Greece and learn their language and you know, become involved even, you know, go and work there. Whereas today, I mean, you know, the effect of the crisis and the way particularly the crisis has been reported around the world, it's, you know, it's very dispiriting. Greece has, let's be honest, has a terrible press. And this coincides with the time when in this country university departments are required to produce statistics on the jobs that people get as a result of doing their degrees. So, you know, we cannot say now, as we could 20 years ago, that people go off to, you know, they go off to work for newspapers in, you know, the Guardian correspondent in Athens is the Londoners of our department. The current UK ambassador to Greece is a PhD student in our department. You know, lots and lots, as you know, of Greek academics have done PhDs in this country. Many of them at King's. But, you know, in the present climate, it's much more difficult to, you know, sort of sell that model.
And they can't come here because they can't afford.
They can't
to
afford
come, especially
to study in Britain.
to London.
So, you know, for these two entirely, you know, unrelated reasons, but they've converged in really making us rethink that whole model of what we teach and how we teach it. As David says, one of the things that has really come to the rescue is the resurgence of classics, the enormous success within classics of classical reception.
That's very important.
And a lot of the teaching that the two of us are engaged in now, in some ways, you know, deals with classical reception.
Yes,
that's
to the point, you may smile at this, but you know, in classes that I teach, I mean, I do actually suggest to students that the history of modern Greece is, you know, is a major chapter in the story of the reception of classical civilization.
Yes.
You know, once upon a time, I mean, it would not have occurred to me to say this. It would not have seemed necessary. But you know, the way the academic disciplines have changed, and of course, if you choose to make that adjustment to present both the literature and the history through that perspective, there are lots of very interesting things that, you know, you can get students to engage with, which result in them learning about the language, the literature, and the history of modern Greece. But it's sort of, you know, it's sort of wrapping it up, it's packaging it, giving it in a, you know, a completely different intellectual and educational context. And we're in the middle of this process now. We're feeling our way.
I would
That's very
add
interesting.
actually
It's
another
very interesting.
positive feature, I think, in big British universities, but perhaps in London more than anywhere else, because so many of the undergraduates are from European countries. That changes the old, let's say, Phil-Hellenic but binary student population we had with pure, plain vanilla British people, Anglo-Greeks or people of Greek descent or Cypriot
Inside.
descent,
Greek Cypriot.
and then Greeks from outside. Now if I'm teaching, I don't know, an undergraduate class on Solomos or Calvos or something, okay, I have to use the English text, but it's very interesting hearing what an Italian or a Lithuanian or a Pole or a Russian says about texts from the period of Romantic Revolution. They bring new perspectives.
That's very important.
And so that is another, you know, we've talked about some of the challenges, but some of the changes in the student population in Britain mean that actually we have a group of students who may be very willing to learn about so-called minor cultures and histories of minor countries. And at least, of course, the Greek crisis makes, because it's a major problem for everybody in the European Union, at least it does wake people up to the fact that Greece is important, albeit not in a very positive way.
So that's very interesting actually. I have a twofold question. So would you actually say that the reception of classics is a new trend or a relatively new trend, particularly in Britain,
The last
that
15
has
years.
rejuvenated, let's say, modern Greek studies, or has shown us a new...
It has the potential to rejuvenate modern Greek studies. I wouldn't go further than that.
But that's interesting.
But
It's a very
we're in
interesting
that
point.
process now.
And maybe it has also to do with the Greek poets like Seferis or Elitis, or the
Or
reception.
I think less with that, to be honest.
Rather than
But
classics
I'll
themselves.
tell you another generational thought I have is that I think for people of a certain age, they grew up with the idea of Seferis and Elitis and so on as being central, and until quite recently living incarnations of Greek tradition. I think the modern student doesn't really know much about anything that happened a long time ago. So for them, it may be just as easy to bring, you know, Solomos to life for them as it is to bring Elitis to life. So that I think it's a, you know, I think there's a specific challenge we have with trying to tell people about the pre-1821 world. So in what we teach here, in the old days when we taught more with language, then we had, you know, courses about folk poetry, Cretan Renaissance, things like that. Now it is fair to say the teaching pretty much begins around the time of the War of Independence, and then goes up to the present.
Now, in this direction, and since you raised this issue of the reception of classics, it seems that some people consider specific themes in modern Greek studies as old, in the sense that there have been generations of scholars who have researched on them or have published on them. Would you share this view? Because it seems that other fields, or perhaps very old fields, might be open to new ideas or new questions, or offer us opportunities for re-examination. You've done a work on Byron lately, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this issue of re-examining and considering the so-called old themes.
Well, I mean, I suppose one of the things that has certainly affected a lot of my work for quite a while now is the reflection that if one is going to study and teach modern Greek language, literature, etc., outside Greece, and really, you know, make that stick and make it, you know, establish a tradition that younger people are going to follow, it's not enough just, I think, to focus on covering the curriculum as it's covered in Greece itself. I mean, for a long time, in many ways, you know, we shadowed here with our the rather small means we had to be rather fewer people. But the gold standard for what we taught was the Philologico and the Aristotelio. And just as other newer universities such as Crete followed that same pattern, and Cyprus, so did we. But for about, I suppose, the last 10 years, maybe more, or in varying degrees, perhaps different, obviously felt differently about this, but it's, on the one hand, you're looking in from outside, so it's important as an outsider, obviously, to master your brief, to be as competent as you possibly can be within the field. But I think working outside Greece, you also have a responsibility to connect what's inside the field with what's outside it, some of which may actually be of interest to people in Greece, who might not have quite the same perspective or the same imperative to follow those particular lines of thought, but also which will sort of galvanise interest in the place outside Greece where we happen to be. So, this is not why I decided to write the biography of Severus by any means, but it did. One of the rewarding sort of consequences of working on the biography of Severus was that I found I had to do a lot of work on Greek history, but also on diplomatic relations between this country and Greece. Because as it happened, Severus was right at the heart of that. And I felt I was learning things myself that in turn I hope to pass on to students and to people who read my biography of Severus, which are, it's not exclusively the, sort of Sepharologia, as it might be within Greece, is actually connecting the poet with the historical context and the internal politics of Greece with the international historical events that the people around Severus were, engaged in. And I suppose, I would say the same, it's more obviously, I suppose, of my recent work on Byron. Which has been, as much about outsiders' understanding of Greece and a kind of imaginative invention of a kind of Greece in the 1820s, which I then tried to map onto the political history of the Greek Revolution, and that's a subject I find absolutely fascinating, and I continue to work with.
And I think in the more modern period, in the Greek language possesses Cavafy, who is the most ecumenically loved of all modern poets in any language. He has many admirers in the English-speaking world. People do sometimes learn modern Greek just to read him. He's been translated more than any other modern poet of any kind. And I think as well, when we look at the situation in Greece intellectually, there are far more younger Greek scholars who are looking at intellectual connections between the English-speaking world and Greek authors. So, Cavafy and Seferis would be obvious ones, but now we have people working on Papagiamandis as a translator of English text and so on. And so I think with, the Greek graduate students who grow up today, they have a much more, let's say, a much more Anglo-Saxon experience in their intellectual formation. It makes them ready to work more comparatively, I think.
Yes. I also meant to go back to Professor Weeks' suggestion about modern Greek histories in English. I don't know if you would like to say a few things about editions, publications, books.
And this British tradition of short histories is very interesting.
Well, I think it is. Going right back to the 19th century, some of the oldest histories of modern Greece that we have were actually first written in English. It was 1832. Greece had only just been recognised when Gordon wrote his History of the Revolution. 1861, Finlay published his last 2 volumes, one of which was a History of the Revolution. That's a famous one. Less famous, but actually a very important study, is Finlay's history, his last volume, which is a history of the reign of King Otto.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's true.
That's, even that, even in terms of the revolution, Trikoupis had only just published his I think 1856 or 58. I think it was the
Midnight.
was the first, the first edition of Trigopi. So it's actually the medium of English is in there right at the beginning in terms of writing the story of how Greece became the modern state it became, and then a little bit the history of independent Greece as well. I think there's a little bit of a gap after that, but certainly in the 20th century. In quite a short period, from about the 80s to today, it's going back to the 70s, there's C.M. Woodhouse, who wrote, he was not an academic, but had a very, wrote a lot of academic books, which are academically serious. He wrote, a history of Greece, which began in 1453. Richard Clarke's short history was first published in 1979.
Which still circulates.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's been through different versions. It now has the form of the concise history in
with a lot of translations.
And there's been new editions 2002 and a recent one, I think, just now. And that's sold in the tens of thousands in a dozen languages. There's in America Thomas Gallant again wrote another short history of Greece, which is it's good, it's racy, it's well written, it's not too long.
And there's another kind of book which sort of combines history with what nowadays people might call, well, they would have called area studies, now they might be more tempted to call cultural studies, and that would be like some of the writings of William Miller, who was a very fine historian who did know Greece very well, the late 19th and early 20th century. And then in the 1960s we had this important, still very readable book, John Campbell and Philip Sherard's Modern Greece.
Yes.
Now we haven't had a work exactly like that which tries to cover the culture and the history in quite, although Gallant's book has moves in that direction.
I suppose it does.
But this idea of a sort of country study where you look at it in a rounded way was something that Campbell and Sherard did very successfully, in the early 1960s. Sorry.
No, Michael Learn Smith did this for Athens, and his short book on Athens. It's partly aimed at tourists, but the serious history in that. Yes, I'm not sure where Campbell and Sherard where that book sits in relation to these short histories, because it's not a history book.
No, it's not a history.
And in some ways, it's very much the product of these two very distinctive individuals. So it's very individualistic, individual book too. But it's never been updated. There's no equivalent of it today. But short histories are popular. Nicholas Doumani's The History of Greece, which is it's a potted history from prehistory up to 2009. It has some of the limitations of trying to cover ancient, medieval, and modern history in one volume. But at least it's an attempt to do that. So there certainly is demand for that kind of short history. But it does puzzle me, and I suppose it may be a reflection on the field, that although we have a number of short histories and they're all good, we don't have anything, once you've gone beyond that, what does the student turn to next? There's actually nothing in English that
That's interesting.
The equivalent, things like like the Cambridge Ancient History, or Cambridge Medieval History, or Cambridge History of dot dot dot, and for writing my brain through examples now, but you think of France, Germany, Italy. There are big volumes and there are multi-volume histories.
Within big publishers, like especially, let's say, Oxford University Press.
So would you say that we have we have these short histories or concise histories, but not multi-volume, more specialized editions that might actually offer us new perspectives or new material.
We're almost over-provided.
On modern Greece.
It's like the translations of Cavafy, there are more than we need. But
and this is not true of Byzantium. You see, I think, obviously Byzantium is a longer period, but it's possible in very big history schools like Oxford to teach a lot of Byzantine history because the students can use so many different books of different characters. if you were teaching modern Greek history, let's say in that context, you would quickly run out of authoritative texts which the students except where they're classics on a specific topic, like, you know, John Petropoulos,
yes,
for example.
Clientelism, this one, state politics,
Yes. Yes, I mean, you know, the Greek Revolution or the...
Douglas Dakin, there are some books, but...
yes, I mean, very dated now, actually, but, you know, but, I mean, the first-rate history of its time, the unification of Greece. But, you know, nowadays that whole sort of unification model, you know, is completely out of date.
Of course.
You know, a historian of Dakin's calibre today would be just as likely to take it, you know, look at it from a rather different, you know, different perspective, and would produce different results. Then you'll be able to compare. Just as the other thing, I mean, what we don't have is a historiography of modern Greece either. I'm not even aware of something in Greek. You may correct me on that.
No, they are not a short book or a book for all the historiography of the state. No. Of the Greek state.
There are some publications.
There are some publications. There are big congress, 2 volumes congress in 2002, but there's no
but not
volume.
A synthetic on the topic. No.
Because I mean, actually, you know, the story of modern Greece, you know, whether you go back to 1453 or to the 1820s, but the way in which different historians, Greek and non-Greek, have, you know, tackled that story over, say, 200 years. I mean, there's an enormous variety and, you know, very rich material there. And I keep thinking it would be marvellous to have, you know, an authoritative, you know, critical synthesis that would, you know, present that material, but also, you know, within a critically aware kind of way. But, you know, we don't have enough in English to justify it yet, at any rate. And of course, let's not forget Toynbee. You know, Toynbee's last book, The Greeks and Their Heritages, that was published posthumously, it's another of those books that attempts to tackle ancient, modern and medieval, you know, within one volume. But that's actually, I find that a very interesting attempt. It's not quite a palinode, but, you know, it's Toynbee looking back over his life and his career and the scandal that he created. And, you know, reflecting in a sometimes rather ill-tempered way on the way in which he thinks the modern Greeks have recreated their own history, you know, in a way that's made trouble for them. But it's a discussion that's sort of been left on the table since 1981 when that book was published.
I think part of the challenge is that a lot of the resources, economically and intellectually, are likely always to go to very contemporary fields. So the LSE, for example, puts on a very successful event every 2 years for doctoral students in modern Greek studies, contemporary modern Greek studies, hundreds of people. If you put on one that's with you know, modern Greek history, you might get 15 or something. So there are people still working on these topics, but they don't really make a subject community, I think, in Britain in the same way.
No,
or in the US, actually.
Yeah, that's exactly the trouble. I mean, the subject community, I mean, modern Greek studies as a subject community does exist. Modern Greek history as a specific community within that, or within history, doesn't really. It's sort of struggling to find an identity, to maintain that identity. It's very much a story of isolated and very distinguished, very well-known individuals.
But the field itself.
But the field itself is not, you know, and, you know, I mean, sadly, as you know, when people leave posts in modern Greek history, they tend not to be replaced. You know, there isn't that institutional underpinning for it. I think that's partly to do with what David says, that modern Greek history has tended to be in modern Greek departments, or, you know, somehow connected with classics, rather than integrated into mainstream history. So it's sort of in between.
Okay, we thank you very much.